Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in the modern world, moving into the reign of the 237th Pope, Alexander VII, who reigned from 1655 to 1667. The conclave of 1655 elected Pope Innocent X's Secretary of State to succeed him. His name was Fabio Chigi, Chigi. He reigned as Pope 237 for 12 years under the name Alexander VII. Born in Siena, Italy, on February 13, 1599, Chigi had spent his entire adult life in the papal diplomatic service. The conclave of 1655 followed the pattern of electing a diplomat to follow a more spiritual, non-politically involved pope. Despite his diplomatic experience, Alexander VII was unable to accomplish much in ending the war between Spain and Portugal, which was a war of independence from the Portuguese perspective and was a rebellion from the Spanish perspective. Alexander's attempts to maintain neutrality antagonized both sides. Neutrality because both were Catholic monarchies. Antagonized both sides because both believed that they were in the right. As a result, Spain refused to accept Alexander's nuncio, and John VI of Portugal made constant threats about setting up a national church, about essentially going Protestant. Alexander VII was an adaptationist in terms of his view of missionary work, so he reversed the 1645 decision of his predecessor, Innocent X, forbidding the Chinese rites. So in other words, Innocent X forbade the Chinese rites, and now Alexander VII reverses that, so the Chinese rites once again became permitted. In the decade after the condemnation by Innocent X, the Jesuits had been active in writing explanations of their methods and expositions of Chinese culture and belief. Their point was to prove that the Chinese rites had allowed their converts, were merely cultural practices that could be harmonized with the Christian deposit of faith, and they were not intrinsically pagan practices which had to be eliminated. Alexander VII accepted this line of reasoning, so the Chinese rites, and this is rites, meaning liturgical rites, were permitted to resume, and the Chinese clergy, a clergy servant in China, were allowed to pray the divine office in Chinese instead of in Latin. But this was not the end of the issue, so future popes will deal with it. Another ongoing issue was that of Jansonism. So it appears in this pontificate as well. After the late Pope Innocent X condemned the 5 propositions extracted from the Augustinus, the Jansonists began using the dodge of acknowledging that those 5 propositions were theologically erroneous, but denying that they were contained in Janson's commentary. This was the famous distinction between right and fact. That's the phrase they used. So they claimed to accept the right of the Pope to rule on matters of teaching, but denied the fact of those propositions being in the commentary, Augustinus. The French government and the French hierarchy, then came up with a new idea, and Alexander VII was happy to help. To this end, a new formulary, a new oath, was created on October 16th, 1656, titled Ad Sacram, demanding an anti-Jansonist oath which specified that the 5 propositions were in the commentary and condemned them in the sense that Janson meant them, and demanded that all clergy and religious swear to this formulary, this oath. This action renewed the alliance mentioned in the previous reign between theological Jansonists, Richerist, Gallicans, conciliarists, and political ideologues who favored popular sovereignty, or democracy, as we'd say today. In this case, Louis XIV wanted the formulary imposed, and he had the force to make the courts follow his will. But the resentment caused by this royal action entered the organizational memory of all the groups involved and would be passed on to the next generation as one of many examples of the alliance between a despotic monarchy and a corrupt church, suppressing the legitimate freedoms of honest Frenchmen. The Jansonists remaining in France refused to take the oath, so they were forced into exile. All their schools were closed by royal order in 1660, and their mother convent at Port Royal was closed by royal action or executive action on April 23rd, 1661. On Christmas Eve, 1654, Pope Alexander VII had the unique experience of seeing the queen of a Protestant country convert to Catholicism. This did not mean that the country returned to Catholicism, as so far that has never happened in history. So she had to surrender her throne in order to become Catholic. The throne she surrendered was that of Sweden. Her name was Christina of the House of Vasa, V-A-S-A. She lived from 1626 to 1689. Her father was the famous Swedish general king Gustavus Adolphus II, who died in battle against Catholics at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632 during the 30 Years' War. She remained in Rome for much of the rest of her life and was a patron of the arts. She lived first at the Palazzo Farnese and then at the Palazzo Riario. And she had a group of intellectuals and artists around her whom she supported, and they referred to themselves as the Arcadian Academy. It was mentioned in previous reigns that Pope Urban VIII appointed Gian Lorenzo Bernini as architect of St. Peter's. Bernini was still around and still had the job in the reign of Pope Alexander VII. So Alexander commissioned him by approving his recommendation to build the vast colonnade in front of St. Peter's Basilica, made up of two semicircular arms projecting from the front of the basilica. It had 248 columns and 88 pillars arranged in quadrangular rows, so four columns deep on each side, topped by 140 larger-than-life statues. So Bernini worked on this concurrently with his other projects until it was completed in 1667. Pope Alexander had a deep personal devotion to St. Francis de Sales, Bishop of Geneva, whom we covered previously. It was said that his copy of Francis's Introduction to the Devout Life was so well used that it could be opened to any page and it would remain open on its own. He canonized St. Francis de Sales in 1665 and promoted his spirituality as being a useful and accessible means for anyone in any state to pursue a life of virtue. For a 12-year reign, Alexander VII had little progress to show in dealing with an increasingly hostile world, especially considering he was a diplomat, and that's one of the reasons he had been elected. Some popes, like his predecessor, just didn't care about the outside world. So they were Catholics, and that's who he cared about, and everybody else, well, who cares? But yet, in terms of larger history, beginning in Alexander's reign, there is an observable phenomenon which, in retrospect, can be identified as the beginning of a reorientation of the general European mind. Not necessarily that every single person living in Europe followed this, but that it's fair to say, maybe not at the beginning, but eventually it became a majority, or at least the ascendant view, and is still with us today. It's still the ascendant view of the Western attitudes today. It's so obvious a change that definite dates can be assigned, and a name is even given to the period. So the period extends from the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648, until the beginning of the French Revolution, 1789. Some histories refer to it as the Age of Reason. Others call it the Enlightenment, for reasons that we'll see. But whatever name is given to it, the momentum of the period was carrying the mainstream of European intellectual development, first outside and then completely against not only the Catholic Church, but against a religious view of the world. Okay, nothing just happens. So, consider. The 30 Years' War is not studied in detail much anymore, except by specialists. And so this is the cause, this lacuna is the cause for a widespread misunderstanding of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was not, as generally presented in secular histories, simply a step in the development of the scientific worldview of modern Western culture. Now, it was such a step, but that's only a detail. So it's accurate, but it is not the totality of the phenomena. At its core, the Enlightenment was something else. It was a reaction against religion itself, legitimized in the minds of those who adhere to it by the abdication by religious leaders of their proper role in favor of entering into political intrigues and military adventures. In this, it fell into the recognizable pattern of Renaissance humanism, which was a reaction against late medieval religion and late medieval scholasticism. That reaction against legitimized in the minds of Renaissance humanists by what they perceived to be the abdication by religious leaders of their credibility, owing to the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism. For this reason, it is no surprise that the Enlightenment held the same principles as Renaissance humanism. Belief that man, or the human, the human person, man, capitalized, is the measure of all things. That quote from Protagoras. And that ultimate truth could not be known because metaphysics is impossible. Or if a metaphysics exists, it's impossible to know definitively, what is the good, the true, and the beautiful, what is objectively right and wrong. That's impossible for us to know. The Enlightenment, that period, and those who consider themselves philosophers of the Enlightenment, they were no more historically aware than our own time is. So they believed they were being creative and original, when in fact their attitudes were nothing more than a restatement of the defective metaphysics of William of Ockham and the defective anthropology of Petrarch. Another term given to this period is rationalism, the period of rationalism. So the reason for rationalism, so connecting the dots, so nothing just happens. The 30 Years' War, like the world wars of the 20th century, was an event after which nothing would ever be the same. For 3 decades, Europeans had slaughtered each other. The death toll is variously estimated, but 11 million is a reasonable calculation of the number dead. Added to that was the suffering inflicted on the survivors by the diseases like cholera, spawned by countless unburied corpses, along with widespread famine, resulting from the death of farm workers and the ruin of farmland beneath the feet of marching armies. 11 million deaths pales compared to the limitless carnage of the 20th century, but considering this number of deaths was inflicted with primitive weapons, and that's a percentage of a much smaller population, it was almost incomprehensible to the 17th century mind. The duration of the conflict also resulted in a deeper psychological and spiritual trauma. 30 years of warfare meant that an entire generation was born, grew up, married, and had children of their own, knowing nothing but a state of seemingly endless mass murder. Officially, over religion. In the popular mind, the 30 Years' War was a war of religion, as had been the many previous wars between the Habsburgs and Lutherans in Germany, such as the war against the Schmalkaldic League, which we covered earlier in the 16th century. So central to this reorientation of the European mind during the Enlightenment period of rationalism, whatever you want to call it, was a pervasive mistrust and disgust with religion, Protestant and Catholic. Seeing religion itself, whichever version it took, as enemies, content to destroy the world in their effort to achieve victory over each other. In hindsight, it's obvious that once France allied itself with Protestant rulers against Catholic Austria, that it was no longer a war of religion. But the average person didn't really think of that. All they knew is what their leaders told them, that they must fight for God. Both Protestant and Catholic leaders used that to keep their people in the fight. As a result, the next generation of intellectuals felt justified in challenging a religious interpretation of life altogether. Moving outside of the contention between Protestants and Catholics, and the contention among the various Protestants, just moving away from that and just challenging the whole concept that religion is a legitimate way to look at the world and a legitimate way to organize life. Further, because of the crushing effects of the war on all levels, economic, political, family life, everything, there were many, a substantial percentage of the population were ready to listen. They proclaimed, the leaders of the Enlightenment, and some we'll get some names, but I just want you to understand the concept. So the leaders, the philosophers of the Enlightenment, proclaimed that they would replace the dogmas, platitudes, and superstitions of both Protestants and Catholics with something certain. And that certainty is human reason. They argued that human reason is the only thing that can provide a solid foundation that other humans can accept, because it can be a basis, because it's not just some abstraction. That in human reason, at least the way they presented it, an argument can be constructed that does not require belief in things that cannot be seen. And the way they understood human reason and rationalism is that they would accept as true only that which is verifiable through experimentation. And reason, understood in that way, would enable the individual to find truth, the maximum amount of truth that is possible to understand, with his or her own powers, without reference to any religious authority, either Protestant ministers or Catholic priest. Now, there were many thinkers in this period who shaped these attitudes. Covering them individually, as they published in the reign of each pope, would be too time-consuming, and it would really be another course. This isn't a whole course in the Enlightenment. So instead, here we'll just summarize some Enlightenment issues, recognizing that all the popes from this point on had to deal with the effects. And then as we go, there are a few very noteworthy thinkers that we will pause to mention. But just understand those are not the only ones. That this was becoming the ascendant movement of Europe, such that that's how we got to where we are. I mean, just the scientific view of the world is the one that is accepted as the prevailing view still in the West, and as well as cultures that are not geographically in the West but influenced by the West. So take it as a group. Enlightenment writers are most often referred to as the philosophes. That just means philosophers, but it's the French word for philosophers. And it often in histories about the Enlightenment, it's often left in that French form, philosophes, italicized, to distinguish them from other kinds of philosophers. So, I mean, not every single philosopher, agreed with this, but so the philosophes are those philosophers who did. The philosophes also, they did not agree with each other on every single thing, but it is fair to say, it is accurate to say, that they shared the following attitudes. First, religion, both Protestant and Catholic, represented an alliance between church and state to keep the population under control by refusing to allow them to reach intellectual maturity. In support of this contention, they pointed to the Protestant ecclesiology of Erastianism or the Catholic ecclesiology of Gallicanism as proving that leaders on both sides used the gospel only as a means of social control and manipulation. Second, the term Enlightenment was coined by a German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T. In the German, it's the Aufklärung, A-U-F-K-L-A-R-U-N-G, who lived from 1724 to 1804. He used that term Enlightenment, defining his own time period. I mean, it was recognized, even people living in the time recognized something was happening, as that this intellectual orientation would free the mind through learning to think as adults instead of living as perpetually unthinking children. So the motto of the Aufklärung, of the Enlightenment, in Kant's words, was the Latin phrase "sapere aude," dare to think or dare to know. And this is in an essay titled "What is the Enlightenment?" in 1784, authored by Kant. Third, the goal of the Enlightenment, in the way that the philosophes understood it, was happiness. Now that's pretty general. I mean, many philosophies, aimed toward that. But for the philosophe, for the Enlightenment philosophers, happiness is achieved through extension of knowledge, acquisition of knowledge, by applying reason, human reason, to the natural world and natural life. So in their ontology is the philosophy of being and existence. So in their understanding of existence, the philosophes were not all of one mind. Some were outright atheist, whereas others were deist, who envisioned that the universe couldn't have just appeared. That there had to be some creator, but they envisioned the creator as like a cosmic watchmaker, who created the mechanisms of the universe according to natural laws, then closed the watch and just lets it operate, so it doesn't interfere anymore. Fourth, the goal of an Enlightenment society was either to eliminate, quarantine, or subjugate all religion, Protestant and Catholic, to the control of the state, because they believed that the state would be controlled by rational minds, uncluttered by religious distractions. So they took it as axiomatic that anyone in authority in the church was irrational and therefore untrustworthy. Fifth, those philosophes who would concede any use at all for Christianity only wrote of Jesus as an ethical guide and teacher. So the last 7 commandments, along with the Beatitudes, that's something they could accept. Even the most famous French philosophe, Voltaire, his actual name was Francois-Marie Arouet, but his pen name was Voltaire, lived from 1694 to 1778. He said he wanted Christianity still taught so that his servants would not steal from him. All right, so that's the secular Enlightenment. Now, just as there developed eventually a Christian version of humanism, there would be a Catholic version of the Enlightenment. Never achieved the numerical majority and never achieved control of the entire movement, but still did exist. There were those who believed that the ideals and principles of the Enlightenment could be harmonized with Catholicism. This pattern of thought, is not only consistent between the two time periods, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, but also recurs again during the next revival in the 1830s and again in the 1960s. So Vatican II can only be properly understood if seen in the context of this cyclical revival of humanism and Enlightenment rationalism in the secular context, and the church, at least some of those in the church, feeling obliged to make modifications in response to it in order to be able to interact with it. Virtually unknown among American Catholics was one of these guys named Antonio Genovesi, Genovesi, lived from 1712 to 1769. He was an early example of the way in which this kind of transformationist attitude, ecclesiology, kind of the diplomatic, let's interact with the world type ecclesiology, responded to the Enlightenment's revival of Renaissance ideas, Renaissance humanism, added to post-30 Years' War anti-religious animosity. So this guy can be considered an early exponent or an early articulator of enlightened Catholicism or Enlightenment Catholicism in the sense of an identifiable school of thought. So Genovesi was ordained a priest in 1736, was Italian. He taught philosophy at the University of Salerno, where he made his first scholarly contributions. His two key works were, first, Elemental Metaphysics was the title of a book, published in 1743, and second, Logic, published in 1745, in which he argued that truth, capitalized truth, has nothing to fear from philosophy and reason, and set about to demonstrate that properly understood, faith and reason do not contradict each other. He demonstrated a thorough familiarity with Aristotle, John Locke, René Descartes. He even took his attempt at synthesis to the point of combining the names. Ontosophy, combining, instead of ontology and philosophy, ontosophy. And theosophy, so instead of theology and philosophy separately. And cosmosophy, instead of cosmology and philosophy separately. He believed that all the problems with the Enlightenment and with Protestants could be resolved by removing the relics of what he labeled medieval Christendom, as those relics, those cultural artifacts, he deemed not essential to the faith. A decade after this attempt at synthesis, Genovesi fell into another recognizable pattern of this school of Catholicism. He left the priesthood and then left the church, becoming a secular academic, a professor of political economy at the University of Naples in 1754, and devoting the remainder of his career to publishing on mercantile economic theory. Enlightenment Catholic ecclesiology the way that Genovese and others proposed it, was heavily influenced by Gallicanism. So, like when it appeared in the United States as Americanism, it would be heavily influenced by that, the national church ecclesiology. Vernacular language was introduced into the liturgies of France and Germany without papal approval. Pious devotions were curtailed or forced out of the churches. That's another characteristic of Enlightenment rationalism. They regard as medieval superstition practices like the novenas and the rosary, devotion to the saints, Eucharistic processions. Church architecture also changed with the stated goal of simplification. Those Catholics who wished to practice novenas, devotion to Our Lady, devotion to the Blessed Sacrament were frowned upon or actively discouraged. The same pattern was followed after Vatican II by some of those who did not actually read the documents of Vatican II, and for exactly the same reasons. A belief that the prevailing current modern thought could be adapted to Catholicism, to the benefit of both secular and sacred, but only if the distracting medieval symbolism was excised. In terms of scholarship, Enlightenment Catholic scholarship imitated the trends of the larger society it admired by applying the Enlightenment understanding of reason to Catholic tradition. The historical critical method of interpreting the Bible, was not invented by Protestants, even though the most famous practitioners were Protestants. But 2 centuries before, the Göttingen professor Julius Wellhausen argued that the Pentateuch was composed of 4 sources compiled centuries after Moses. A French Oratorian priest named Richard Simon lived from 1638 to 1712, argued that Moses was not the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Torah. He argued this in a work titled Critical History of the Old Testament, published in 1678. Now, for this, he was condemned. He refused to recant, so he was expelled from the order in the same year, 1678. And like Genovese, he just left the church. Once again, this approach to the Bible characterized this form of Catholicism in the Enlightenment and in the 19th century during the Modernist period, and after Vatican II by one category of scholars. And, that many left the church. But to put it another way, some scholars would be condemned over the ensuing centuries, whereas the works of others would eventually become respected additions to the corpus of Catholic thought. What separates the two is not their method. It's not just the historical critical method. What separates the two was their humility and their sincerity. Those scholars who were sincere accepted church pronouncements of their time, sometimes to the extent that they stopped writing, just out of obedience. Whereas, and those often had their writings rehabilitated later, sometimes after their death, when the church judged that it was safe to do so. During the 30 Years' War, it was not safe to do so. Whereas those scholars, on the other side, those who were too prideful to accept church authority, ended their lives outside of it. They just left the church embittered and lost their faith. So humility is one of the surest gauges of a person's character in any age. The Enlightenment did much damage to the church and to the Western mind. It continues to do so. The Catholic version of the Enlightenment attempted to do good for the church, and some did. It did do some good. But in the end, Catholicism could never be reconciled with the totality of the Enlightenment, with the secular version of the Enlightenment, because it presupposes a separation of faith and reason. And that separation is irrational to a properly ordered mind. It is this problem which continues to plague pontiffs in their capacity as teachers to this day. Pope Alexander VII died on May 22nd, 1667. His reign was followed by the 18-month pontificate of Clement IX, to whom we will turn next. So for now, thank you for your attention.